In the ancient scrolls of the Bible, in the book of Joshua, there is a passage that has baffled believers, skeptics, scientists, and theologians alike for thousands of years. It describes a moment so astonishing, so beyond comprehension, that even modern physics would tremble at the thought. The scene is set in the heat of battle. The Israelites, under Joshua's command, are locked in conflict with their enemies. Victory seems within reach, but time is slipping away. Then, in one of the most remarkable prayers recorded in history, Joshua calls out to the Lord and says, "Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Aijalon." And the text declares that the sun stood still and the moon stopped until the nation avenged itself upon its enemies. What does it mean for the sun to stand still? Was this a miracle of cosmic proportions? A suspension of the very laws of the universe? Or is there something deeper hidden behind the text, something that points to mysteries beyond what human eyes can see? This single event raises questions that stretch from the battlefield of Gibeon all the way to the edges of cosmology and metaphysics. If the sun truly stopped, then how could the Earth's rotation, bound by inertia and gravity, have been halted without catastrophe? And if it was not the physical sun, then what kind of divine intervention took place that day? These are the questions that ignite both faith and wonder. To truly understand, we must first step back into the world of Joshua. The Israelites had just crossed into the Promised Land after wandering for 40 years in the desert. They were facing mighty kings, fortified cities, and armies that outnumbered them. Humanly speaking, their chances of survival were slim, yet they marched with confidence, for they believed the God who parted the Red Sea and tore down the walls of Jericho could also deliver their enemies into their hands. But this particular battle was different. It wasn't just about swords and shields, it was about time itself. Joshua needed more daylight to secure the victory, and so he dared to ask for what no one else would even dream of: the stopping of the very heavens. Now imagine yourself standing there on that battlefield. The clamor of war, the dust rising in the valley, the cries of soldiers echoing across the hills. And then, silence. Not silence of sound, but silence of the sky. The sun unmoving, frozen above the horizon. The shadows not shifting, the day refusing to yield to night. What would that feel like? How would the soldiers react? Would awe or terror sweep over them as they realized they were living in a day that defied all reason? Some skeptics suggest this story is nothing more than ancient myth, a poetic way of saying the battle lasted long and the Israelites gained victory. Others argue it could be a description of a solar eclipse or an atmospheric phenomenon where the light lingered longer than usual. But believers see it differently. They see the hand of God, bending time and space to answer the cry of his servant. And here, the questions deepen even further. If God can make the sun stand still, then what are the limits of his power? Is there any boundary between natural law and divine will? Could the God who designed the cosmos also rewrite the script of physics in a single moment? But even within the Bible itself, this miracle is not isolated. We find echoes of cosmic wonders elsewhere. In the book of Isaiah, the shadow on the steps moved backward as a sign to King Hezekiah. In the Gospels, the sky turned dark at midday when Christ was crucified. These are not just poetic flourishes. They are moments when heaven itself bends into history, reshaping human events. So the question becomes, was Joshua's long day a unique suspension of nature, or part of a larger pattern where God occasionally interrupts the ordinary flow of creation to reveal his power? And then there is the question of perspective. To the ancient mind, the sun rose and set, moving across the dome of the sky. They did not yet understand heliocentrism, or the fact that it is the earth that rotates on its axis. So when Joshua prayed, he spoke in the language of his world: "Sun, stand still." But what actually happened? Did the earth itself stop spinning? Did God slow the rotation without destroying the balance of oceans, winds, and tectonic forces? Modern science tells us that such a halt would cause global devastation. The seas would surge in massive tsunamis, the atmosphere would whip across the planet with unimaginable force. Yet the text describes none of this. The day stretched on, the battle was won, and the world continued. Could this suggest that what took place was not a literal halting of planetary motion, but rather a supernatural stretching of time itself? This leads us into one of the most fascinating discussions, the nature of time in Scripture. Time is not just a ticking clock. It is a dimension, a fabric woven into creation itself. The Bible begins with time, in the beginning, but throughout the narrative, time bends to God's will. Days are lengthened, seasons are altered, prophecies leap across centuries. Could it be that what Joshua experienced was not the stopping of a planet, but the divine suspension of time as humans perceive it? Imagine a day where the clock does not advance, yet events unfold as if hours are granted. For Joshua, that may have been the miracle, not a frozen sun, but a gift of extended time. And still others propose that the account was symbolic, reflecting the psychological perception of the soldiers. In the heat of battle, with adrenaline surging, moments can feel longer, almost suspended. Victory itself can feel like eternity compressed into a few minutes. Could the text be capturing the way the Israelites perceived that day? A battle that seemed endless, a triumph that felt like time itself bowed before them. Or does such an interpretation diminish the majesty of what God truly did? Interestingly, when we explore ancient records from outside the Bible, we find strange parallels. Cultures across the globe speak of a long day or a long night in their myths and oral traditions. Chinese legends recall days when the sun lingered. The Aztecs and Mayans told of a time when daylight refused to fade. Could these be cultural echoes of the same event, scattered across civilizations, remembered in different tongues? If so, then Joshua's miracle may not have been an isolated legend, but a global phenomenon that imprinted itself on human memory. This also brings us to another mystery. What is the relationship between miracles and natural laws? Do miracles break the laws of nature, or do they reveal laws higher than we yet understand? For instance, when Jesus walked on water, was gravity suspended? Or was there a hidden principle of creation at work that human science has not yet discovered? Likewise, when Joshua saw the sun stand still, was physics overturned, or was the Creator simply reaching into his creation, demonstrating mastery over the very framework he designed? As we press further, the philosophical questions expand. If time itself can be altered, then what does that mean for our understanding of destiny, prophecy, and God's sovereignty? Could the same God who extended Joshua's day also extend the days of our lives, bending time to fulfill his purposes? And if human history can be altered by prayer, then how much influence do our cries have in the unfolding of cosmic events? Joshua did not ask timidly. He commanded boldly in faith, trusting that the God of Israel would hear. What does this say about the power of prayer and the authority given to those who walk in alignment with God's will? And notice how the miracle of the long day is not just about spectacle. It is tied directly to justice and warfare. The sun did not stand still for entertainment. It stood still for judgment. It was about victory over enemies, about the fulfillment of God's covenant promises. This means that miracles are never random. They are purposeful, deeply intertwined with God's plan for his people. They serve as signs, as revelations, as instruments of deliverance. And in this way, Joshua's miracle becomes not just a story of cosmic wonder, but a testimony of divine faithfulness. Yet the more we examine it, the more mysterious it becomes. What truly happened on that day in Gibeon? Was it the halting of celestial bodies, the bending of time, the perception of endless daylight, or something else entirely, something beyond human language? Could it have been a vision granted to the soldiers, or even a foreshadowing of an eternal truth yet to come? Where in the kingdom of God there will be no night at all, for the Lord himself will be the light. And here the discussion widens again, because the Bible often uses cosmic imagery as a sign of greater spiritual realities. The sun and moon are not only lights in the sky, they are symbols of power, authority, and divine order. For the sun to stand still could also mean that the order of creation itself bowed in obedience to the command of God's servant. It is a picture of cosmic submission, the heavens themselves aligning with God's purposes on earth. What does it mean when creation responds to the voice of a human being empowered by divine authority? What does it mean when the universe pauses for the sake of God's people? From here we could trace the theme into prophecy, into apocalyptic visions, into the mysteries of the end times where the sun and moon again play roles in God's final revelation. Because Joshua's long day is not just about the past, it echoes forward, pointing to the day when time itself will be fulfilled, when the heavens will be rolled back, and when divine light will replace the need for sun and moon altogether. To understand Joshua's long day more deeply, we must not only read the words in isolation, but place them in the grand tapestry of biblical history. The book of Joshua is not merely about conquest. It is about God establishing his people in the land, promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Every victory, every miracle, was tied to covenant fulfillment. When the sun stood still, it was not simply for military success. It was a sign that God was directly intervening in history, shaping the destiny of nations in real time. Jewish tradition holds a fascinating perspective on this event. The Talmud records discussions about Joshua's day, interpreting it not only as a literal miracle, but also as a testimony to Joshua's authority as a prophet. For the sages, the miracle confirmed that Joshua stood in the same line as Moses, through whom the Red Sea had parted. Just as Moses commanded creation and it obeyed, so too Joshua spoke, and the heavens responded. In this way, the event elevated Joshua in the eyes of Israel and their enemies alike. He was not just a military commander, but a chosen vessel of divine authority. But the Bible does not stop there. When we read carefully, we see that the book of Habakkuk also makes reference to cosmic warfare. In Habakkuk 3:11, the prophet declares, "The sun and moon stood still in their habitation. At the light of your arrows they went, at the shining of your glittering spear." Was this a poetic allusion back to Joshua's day? Or was Habakkuk revealing a recurring theme where celestial signs accompany divine judgment? The language suggests that the movement of heavenly bodies is not fixed beyond God's control, but is bound up with his actions in history. This gives us another layer. Joshua's long day is not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a larger biblical motif where creation itself fights for God's people. We also find echoes in the book of Judges, where stars are described as fighting from their courses against Sisera. The Bible is full of these cosmic images. The heavens are not passive backdrops, but participants in divine warfare. In Joshua's case, the hailstones that fell upon the Amorites just before the long day began are described as striking down more enemies than the swords of Israel did. Here we see not only the stillness of the sun, but the cooperation of nature itself, hail, sun, moon, all wielded by God as instruments of battle. This brings us to a crucial biblical historical layer. The Israelites understood that their victories were not by might or by power alone, but by the direct intervention of the Creator of heaven and earth. Ancient Jewish commentators also noted the significance of Joshua invoking both the sun and the moon. Why not simply the sun? The rabbis explained that Joshua was addressing both the day and the night. He was commanding not just time to pause, but the entire cosmic order. This dual command reflects the Genesis creation narrative, where the sun rules the day and the moon the night. By addressing both, Joshua demonstrated his understanding that God's dominion extended over all times and seasons. It was as if Joshua was saying, "Day you cannot end, night you cannot begin, not until God's purposes are accomplished." Looking outside the biblical record, early church fathers such as Origen, Augustine, and Jerome grappled with this miracle as well. Augustine, in The City of God, argued that the event was a literal suspension of time, a miracle meant to show that God is Lord of both nature and history. He saw it as a testimony that the God of Israel was greater than the pagan deities associated with the sun and moon. For in the ancient world, surrounding nations worshipped the sun god Shamash, the moon goddess Sin, and other celestial deities. Joshua's prayer, then, was not just practical, it was theological warfare. By commanding the sun and moon, Joshua was declaring the supremacy of Yahweh over the very deities worshipped by Israel's enemies. This transforms the miracle into a cosmic polemic. The battle was not just earthly, it was spiritual. And this brings us to another historical dimension. Archaeological findings reveal that the Canaanite peoples, including the Amorites, often tied their gods to celestial bodies. Temples aligned with solstices, inscriptions invoking solar and lunar deities, and myths of cosmic struggle all reflect this worldview. Imagine, then, the shock of the Amorites when Israel's God demonstrated mastery over the very forces they worshipped. It was not only a defeat on the battlefield, but a devastating blow to their religion. The miracle undermined their gods, proving that Yahweh alone ruled the heavens and the earth. When we widen the lens to global history, we find astonishing parallels. Ancient Chinese records describe a long day during the reign of Emperor Yao, a figure said to have lived at the same approximate time as Joshua. Mayan chronicles speak of a day when the sun stood still. Even the Greek historian Herodotus preserves traditions of unusual solar phenomena remembered by Egyptian priests. Could it be that Joshua's long day was witnessed across the world, recorded in different cultures according to their own traditions? If so, then this miracle was not a local wonder, but a global event, a moment when the whole earth bore witness to the God of Israel. Returning to the Hebrew Scriptures, we must not miss how the miracle is embedded in Israel's national memory. The book of Jasher, a lost text referenced in Joshua 10, is cited as a witness to this event. Though the book itself has not survived, its mention indicates that Joshua's long day was celebrated in Israelite tradition as a foundational moment, just as the Exodus and the crossing of the Jordan were. The day the sun stood still was remembered as part of Israel's identity, proof that their God would intervene in impossible situations to secure his covenant. But even beyond Israel, the motif of extended or supernatural days continues into prophecy. The prophet Zechariah speaks of a day known to the Lord, neither day nor night, when evening will bring light. Could this be a prophetic echo of Joshua's long day, pointing forward to the messianic age when time itself will bend to the purposes of God? And in Revelation, John speaks of a future where there will be no more night, where the Lamb will be the everlasting light. These connections suggest that Joshua's long day was not only a historical miracle, but also a prophetic sign, a foreshadowing of the ultimate triumph of God's kingdom. This biblical historical lens also invites us to examine the role of leadership. Joshua, standing as Moses' successor, was validated through this miracle. Just as the Red Sea had validated Moses, the long day validated Joshua. Each great leader in Israel's history was confirmed by miracles, Moses by plagues and partings, Joshua by the sun and moon, Elijah by fire from heaven, and Jesus by resurrection itself. This pattern shows that God's leaders were authenticated not merely by words, but by acts of divine power. Joshua's long day therefore fits into the larger biblical rhythm of God, confirming his chosen vessels through signs and wonders. Even the setting of the miracle, the Valley of Ajalon, has historical resonance. This valley became a place of repeated conflict in Israel's history, a strategic corridor between the coastal plains and the central highlands. Later battles under Saul and Jonathan would also be fought near this region. The fact that the sun stood still over Gibeon and the moon over Ajalon is not incidental. It ties the geography of Israel into its theology, stamping the very landscape with the memory of God's intervention. And so, when we trace the event through layers of scripture, tradition, archaeology, and ancient history, we see that Joshua's long day is far more than a simple narrative. It is a node of interconnected meanings, a theological declaration, a cosmic sign, a cultural confrontation, a validation of leadership, and a foreshadowing of eschatological hope. Each layer deepens the mystery, reminding us that biblical history cannot be reduced to mere human categories. As we continue through the biblical historical dimensions of Joshua's long day, it becomes clear that this event was remembered not only as a single miracle, but as part of a larger pattern of God's dealings with his people. The ancient rabbis often wrestled with how to understand miracles, especially ones that involved the cosmos. In their discussions, preserved in Midrashim and the Talmud, they noted that miracles were not arbitrary, but were prepared from the foundation of the world. According to some rabbinic traditions, the moment when the sun stood still was already written into creation itself, as if God had woven into the fabric of time a day when time itself would stretch. This gives us a profound biblical historical insight. Miracles were not seen as random interruptions, but as hidden appointments preordained by God. In Midrash Rabbah, some commentators linked Joshua's miracle with earlier events in the Torah. They pointed out that when Moses lifted his staff at the Red Sea, the waters obeyed, and when Joshua commanded the sun, the heavens obeyed. Both miracles were a testimony to Israel's covenantal relationship with God. Just as nature itself bent before Moses to deliver Israel from Egypt, so nature bent before Joshua to establish them in Canaan. This created a parallel narrative that bound Moses and Joshua together in Israel's memory, presenting them as leaders through whom God's sovereignty over creation was revealed. The Dead Sea Scrolls, unearthed in the caves of Qumran, also shed light on how the Second Temple Jewish community thought about cosmic wonders. Some fragments reflect on the wars of light and darkness, where celestial signs accompany divine judgment. Though they do not directly reference Joshua's long day, the underlying worldview is the same. Cosmic events were inseparably tied to God's redemptive history. For those communities, Joshua's miracle was not just about extending daylight, it was about the alignment of heaven and earth in holy war. The sun and moon, as created lights, became instruments in the divine plan. Later, biblical writers also borrowed imagery that recalls Joshua's day. The prophet Joel, in his apocalyptic vision, declares that the sun and moon grow dark, and the stars lose their brightness in the day of the Lord. Though opposite in form, the imagery echoes the same theme. The heavenly bodies participate in the unfolding of God's purposes. What Joshua experienced in a single battle became a template for how Israel understood cosmic signs throughout history. When the prophets spoke of final judgment, they often reached back to images of the sun and moon as symbols of divine intervention. Joshua's long day, then, was not forgotten, but became a cornerstone for apocalyptic imagination. The intertestamental literature, such as the Book of Enoch, also develops this theme. Enoch speaks of the courses of the sun and moon, the appointed paths of the luminaries, and the angelic beings who govern their movements. Within this framework, Joshua's command to the sun and moon takes on an even greater meaning. It was not only physical luminaries that were addressed, but the angelic powers associated with them. Ancient Jewish readers would have understood that Joshua's authority extended into the spiritual realm, commanding not just lights in the sky, but the very beings that oversaw their order. This interpretation places Joshua's miracle within the broader struggle between the powers of heaven and the powers of darkness, a theme that continues into New Testament writings. Josephus, the Jewish historian of the 1st century, also preserves mention of Joshua's miracle in his Antiquities of the Jews. While brief, his account underscores that this event was not treated as mere legend, but as historical memory within Jewish tradition. He writes of it with the same confidence as other biblical events, suggesting that to him and his audience, the stopping of the sun was part of Israel's authentic history, passed down as testimony of God's intervention. The fact that Josephus recorded it alongside political and military events demonstrates how deeply the miracle was embedded in Jewish national identity. When we turn to the early Christians, the miracle continued to be remembered in ways that extended its meaning. Church fathers like Chrysostom and Jerome drew parallels between Joshua and Jesus, noting that the name Joshua in Hebrew is the same as Yeshua, which in Greek becomes Jesus. Just as Joshua commanded the sun and moon, so too Jesus commanded the storm and the seas, and even the powers of death. For the early church, Joshua's long day foreshadowed Christ's dominion over creation. The miracle was not isolated to the Old Testament, but found its fulfillment in the one greater than Joshua. This historical interpretation added another layer, linking the miracle to the broader arc of salvation history. Another biblical historical thread worth exploring is how Israel's enemies would have interpreted the event. The Amorites, Canaanites, and other nations worshipped deities tied to the cycles of the heavens. To them, the sun and moon were not impersonal lights, but living gods. When Joshua commanded them to halt, and when they obeyed, it was a devastating sign that the God of Israel ruled over the gods of the nations. In the broader ancient Near Eastern context, this would have been more than a military defeat. It was the shattering of their worldview. This explains why the miracle is described not only as a victory, but as a terror to surrounding nations who heard of it. Moreover, the event had long-term historical consequences. Later, Israelite kings would often appeal to God's power over nature as evidence of his supremacy. Psalmists would sing of the sun, moon, and stars as servants of the Lord. The memory of Joshua's miracle became part of Israel's worship, reinforcing the conviction that creation itself was under Yahweh's rule. This was a stark contrast to their neighbors who worshipped the creation rather than the Creator. Joshua's miracle thus helped shape Israel's distinct identity in a world saturated with sun and moon cults. Another fascinating historical note arises from the mention of the book of Jasher in Joshua 10. This mysterious text, no longer preserved in its original form, is cited as an external witness to the miracle. The fact that Joshua's author references another written source indicates that the event was documented in Israel's broader literary tradition. The book of Jasher is also referenced in 2 Samuel, suggesting it was a collection of national records or heroic songs. This means Joshua's long day was not only remembered in sacred scripture, but also celebrated in Israel's cultural memory. It was sung, recorded, and embedded in the national story. And we cannot forget how this miracle reverberated through later Jewish mystical thought. The Kabbalistic tradition, much later in medieval times, often meditated on the nature of light, time, and divine intervention. For them, the miracle of Joshua revealed a glimpse into the hidden relationship between earthly events and heavenly realities. They would ponder questions like, did God bend the flow of time itself? Did he allow Israel a glimpse into eternity, where time stands still before the throne of God? While these mystical reflections developed centuries after the biblical period, they show how deeply Joshua's miracle continued to inspire wonder in Jewish history. From another perspective, the miracle highlights the interplay between divine sovereignty and human agency. Joshua prayed, or rather commanded in bold faith, and God answered. Historically, this was remembered as an example of how leaders in Israel could partner with God in shaping history. The rabbis would later reflect on the power of righteous individuals to intercede, to call upon heaven, and see creation itself respond. Joshua's miracle became a reference point for discussions about prayer, faith, and authority, not just in ancient times but in the centuries that followed. Even the geographical memory persisted. The valley of Ajalon, mentioned in Joshua's command, continued to carry associations with divine intervention. Later generations who passed through that valley would remember not just the battles fought there, but the day when the heavens themselves paused over its hills. Place and miracle became inseparable, binding geography and theology together in Israel's memory. When we look further into the history of Israel, Joshua's long day became more than a record of divine intervention. It became a pattern by which later generations interpreted the role of cosmic signs in Israel's destiny. The prophets continually drew upon the imagery of the heavens as indicators of God's purposes. Isaiah proclaimed that, "The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine in the day of the Lord's judgment." Ezekiel echoed similar themes, linking the collapse of empires like Egypt and Babylon to cosmic disturbances. These descriptions, though often poetic, reveal a continuity with Joshua's day. The heavens are never neutral. They are participants in history, reflecting divine will. In apocalyptic writings of the Second Temple period, we see this theme magnified. Texts like Wern Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Sibylline Oracles reflect a worldview in which celestial bodies were not only lights, but spiritual rulers, bound by divine decree. For these writers, Joshua's miracle was evidence that God's authority extended over the very angels or powers behind the luminaries. When Joshua commanded the sun and moon, he was in effect declaring that Yahweh ruled over both natural and supernatural realms. This historical perspective gave Israel a unique identity among nations. While others trembled before the stars, Israel's God commanded them. The link between Joshua's miracle and messianic expectation is also crucial. In the Second Temple period, many Jews anticipated a coming Redeemer who would once again bring cosmic upheaval. The Dead Sea sectarians, whose writings were found at Qumran, often described final battles in terms of cosmic signs: stars falling, light and darkness warring, the moon turning to blood. For them, Joshua's long day was not just history. It was a foreshadowing of the final war of God's people against the powers of darkness. Just as the sun and moon stood still for Joshua, so too the heavens would shake for the coming Messiah. When we examine the Greek Septuagint translation of Joshua 10, we notice subtle linguistic choices. The translators rendered the event in a way that emphasizes permanence, as though the sun and moon were not merely delayed but fully suspended in obedience. This Greek version influenced later Hellenistic Jews and early Christians, who often interpreted the miracle with philosophical undertones. In a world shaped by Greek thought, where the cosmos was believed to follow fixed laws, the idea that the Creator could alter celestial motion reinforced the biblical conviction that God was sovereign over both order and miracle. In the broader ancient Near Eastern context, Joshua's miracle stands as a direct challenge to surrounding mythologies. The Babylonians revered Shamash, the sun god, as the divine judge of the cosmos. The Canaanites venerated Baal, whose authority was tied to cycles of rain and fertility connected with celestial timing. Yet in Joshua's day, these deities were humiliated. The very heavens they claimed to control responded not to their worshippers, but to the voice of Israel's God. Historically, this would have reverberated far beyond the battlefield. It was theological warfare, striking at the heart of the religious systems around Israel. Even later, biblical narratives preserved this memory. The psalmist declared, "The sun knows its setting, and the moon and stars he appointed for seasons." These verses are not mere observations of nature. They are affirmations of God's rulership over time. For Israel, the memory of Joshua's long day infused their worship. Every sunrise and moonrise was not just a natural cycle, but a reminder that these lights once paused at the command of God's servant. History and worship merged, embedding the miracle into Israel's theology of creation. The role of celestial signs in Israel's history only grows clearer as we move into the prophetic era. Amos, for example, proclaimed that God would make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. This imagery reflects not just natural disasters, but divine judgment written across the heavens. It parallels Joshua's experience. The sun and moon are not independent forces, but instruments in the hand of the Almighty. Historically, Israel's prophets used these images to call their nation back to covenant faithfulness, reminding them that the same God who could halt the sun could also darken it in wrath. The New Testament writers also inherited this framework. In the Gospels, when Jesus was crucified, the sun itself was darkened. Luke records that darkness covered the land from the 6th to the 9th hour. This was not an accidental atmospheric event. It was interpreted as heaven bearing witness to earth-shaking events, just as it had in Joshua's day. For early Christians, the miracle of the long day foreshadowed the ultimate cosmic testimony, the heavens themselves responding to the death of the Messiah. We can also trace how Joshua's miracle was remembered in Jewish festivals and liturgy. The Feast of Passover, tied to cycles of the moon, always reminded Israel of God's control over celestial order. Likewise, the Feast of Trumpets and the Day of Atonement, marked by lunar phases, reinforced that Israel's sacred time was bound to the luminaries. But Joshua's long day showed that God was not bound by them. He could override their cycles to deliver his people. Historically, this became part of Israel's theology of time itself. Sacred history was not dictated by the stars, but by the God who created them. Later, Jewish apocalyptic traditions, such as those found in 2 Esdras, describe the final day of the Lord in terms that recall Joshua's miracle, a day when the sun shines for longer than its appointed time, when the order of creation bends to reveal God's purposes. This continuity demonstrates how deeply Joshua's event shaped the way Israel thought about the end of history. The long day of Joshua was seen as a miniature version of the final day to come. Even early rabbinic debates about the Messiah often touched on cosmic signs. Some argued that when Messiah comes, the light of the sun will be sevenfold, drawing from Isaiah 30:26. This expectation is a direct theological development of the belief that God can alter celestial light and time. In this way, Joshua's miracle was not just a moment in the past, but a foundation for future hope. Historically, the Valley of Ajalon itself continued to carry symbolic weight. Later Jewish writings refer to it as a place marked by God's intervention, much like the Red Sea or Mount Sinai. The landscape became sacred memory, a testimony written into geography. Pilgrims and travelers who moved through that valley were not simply crossing terrain. They were entering a place where heaven once paused. This intertwining of land and miracle reinforced Israel's connection to its soil, a connection central to their national identity. From another angle, Joshua's long day also speaks into the biblical concept of signs and wonders. Throughout the Pentateuch and the historical books, signs are given as confirmations of God's promises. The plagues in Egypt were signs, the parting of the Jordan was a sign, and the standing still of the sun was yet another. In biblical history, these signs were not just displays of power, they were revelations of covenant faithfulness. They marked turning points in Israel's journey. Joshua's long day, therefore, stands as one of the great covenantal signs, reminding future generations that God fights for his people. The miracle's significance grew in the centuries after Joshua. By the time of the Maccabees, when Israel once again fought against overwhelming enemies, stories of past deliverances, including Joshua's long day, were invoked as encouragement. Historical memory of cosmic signs fueled courage in later generations. For the Maccabees, as for Joshua, the belief was clear: if God could command the heavens, he could grant victory again. In tracing the mystery of the day when the sun stood still, we have journeyed through layers of time, scripture, and history. We looked into the pages of Joshua's conquest, where a desperate prayer rose from the lips of a commander chosen by God, and heaven itself seemed to bend to his voice. We examined how ancient civilizations, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, recorded strange celestial events that align with the possibility of a day unlike any other. We explored how Jewish tradition preserved the account with sacred reverence, how early Christian interpreters found in it a testimony to divine intervention, and how skeptics wrestled with the implications of a universe ruled not merely by natural law, but by the one who authored it. We considered the cosmic weight of what it would mean for the earth to pause, for the heavens to shift, for the cycles of time to halt even for a moment. Was it a literal freezing of the heavens, a slowing of the earth's rotation by divine command, or was it a miracle of perception where God altered human sight to magnify his glory? Whatever the mechanics, the essence remains. Israel's God, the creator of heaven and earth, demonstrated that the cosmos itself responds to his will. We uncovered echoes of this miracle across ancient cultures, legends of elongated days, forgotten calendars, and cosmic disturbances that suggest humanity remembered a shared trauma in the sky. We followed how later prophets, psalmists, and even apocalyptic writers recalled Joshua's victory as a sign that the God of Israel was not bound by natural order, but ruled above it. And we saw how this event was not just a battle strategy, but a declaration. The God who created the sun and moon could summon them to stillness. Yet beyond the science, beyond the speculation, lies the heartbeat of the story: faith. Joshua stood in the valley surrounded by enemies and dared to ask for the impossible. His voice, lifted in prayer, altered the course of history. This was no mere military account. It was a testimony of covenant, a reminder that when God fights for his people, even the heavens can be moved. As we reflect, we find ourselves standing in awe. The sun that stood still in Joshua's day still rises over us each morning, a silent witness to the God who governs time. The same power that stretched out the heavens is the power that hears our prayers today. And though scholars debate, historians search, and scientists calculate, the story still speaks. Our God is not confined by human understanding. This event, frozen in the annals of Scripture, continues to ripple through history. It challenges us to see beyond the boundaries of nature, to glimpse the majesty of the supernatural, and to remember that the Creator is not only the author of the laws of the universe, but also the Lord, who can suspend them for the sake of his people. And so, as the sun sets on this exploration, we stand where Joshua once stood, between heaven and earth, caught in the mystery of a God who makes the impossible possible. The miracle of the long day is more than an ancient tale. It is a reminder that in the hands of the Almighty, time itself is a servant. This is the story of a battle, a prayer, and a God who stilled the cosmos to fulfill his promise. The question remains, when the sun stood still, was it history, was it miracle, or was it both? And if the God of Joshua could bend time once, what mysteries of his power still remain waiting to be revealed?